Okay, so 8.5 recently released, and with it came a map and a scenario and some units, and we will be taking a look at the new units in this little video. And the focus was Rohan and the Orcs of the Misty Mountains, two factions which were in need of a bit of a power increase, and I'm glad to say they have got it. So let's take a look at Rohan's new units. So one of these units actually isn't from 8.5, but I didn't actually cover it when it was released, so I'll put it in here. And it did actually get rebalanced quite a bit in 8.5 anyway, so that's nice. But starting at this end, we have the Marshals of the Red. Now they are of course a shock infantry with the big axes, which is a good addition for Rohan to have. It means they have more bite in their melee infantry. The Riddermark Axemen were always pretty good, but they weren't high end, they were more mid-tier. The Marshals of the Red, on the other hand, have got 36 attack, 40 defense, and 14 charge. They have 2 hit points. Usually they have 96 men in the unit. They cost 1100 florins, and they inspire nearby troops. They're good versus cavalry and armor, and have excellent armor and stamina. This is a very good unit, in fact. These sorts of stats are what would get it onto the top 10 shock infantry list pretty comfortably. Especially considering that it's also good versus cavalry, which a great deal of the shock infantry doesn't actually have, but then, those are the sword units, I believe. I think the axes, generally speaking, are good against cavalry. So the Marshals of the Red are no exception there. They're essentially just super-powered Riddermark Axeman. And it gives Rohan a lot of bite on the attack. It means that if you combine this with their Royal Guard, they actually have a half-decent melee infantry force now. It's not going to be able to compete with some of the better infantry factions, but it's still enough to now hold their own, which is nice. Moving on, we have the Shield Maidens. I think this is the first female unit in the game. But they have 15 attack, 25 defense, and 7 charge, and they are a javelin unit, so they have 16 missile damage. This means they're a pretty decent in melee javelin unit with a fairly high missile damage. This puts them as a similar unit to the Corsair Blackguards, really. Only I think these guys, well, these girls have got more ammunition than them, so in many ways the Shield Maidens could be considered more useful than the Blackguards. They're certainly, looking at the stats, I imagine one of the better javelins. I haven't had a chance to test any of these new units out, but certainly all of Rohan's new stuff appears to be very, very useful indeed, and the Shield Maidens no exception. Rohan at range, in terms of their archers, have always been a little bit lackluster. The Shield Maidens give them at least some sort of ranged ability as well. They can also inspire nearby troops. They can form shield wall, which is kind of interesting for a ranged unit. They're good versus armor. They have good armor and excellent stamina, so all of these are pretty darn good stats. They have 152 in the unit, and they cost 550, so they're also very cheap. I can see this being a very cost-effective unit, because even if you don't get to fire off many volleys of their javelins, they're still good in melee, which is nice to have. They're not going to be able to beat high-tier infantry, of course, but they're going to be able to hold the line a good deal longer than, like, Helmingars, for example. So that's very nice indeed. Moving on to the unit that was in the game before, but I didn't cover at the time, is the Royal Lords. They have actually been buffed in 8.2 anyway, and they have 14 attack, 47 defense, and 18 charge, so they have the highest level of charge, similar to the Elven Cavalry. They also have 3 hit points, and they have 57 men in the unit. They cost 1400 each, but these base stats alone mean I would be surprised if the Royal Lords honestly weren't the best heavy cav unit now, or at least right up there with the Imladris Cavalry and the Knights of the Silver Swan, but Rohan's cavalry is now very, very deadly, as it should be. And they inspire nearby troops. They're good versus cavalry and armor. They can form wedge and excellent armor and stamina. All of the right things that are required for them to be right up there. I would be surprised if I ran the tests again and these guys were not number 1, based on their stats. That 3 hit points is really what puts them over the edge, because they are able to back that up with a nice charge and having more men in the unit, as opposed to like the Witch Realm Inquisitors and the Black Numenorians that are mounted from Mordor. But yes, that's the Royal Lords. And finally, we have Mounted Shield Maidens, which are of course a javelin-based cavalry. And they have 14 attack, 23 defense, and 12 charge. That's a pretty high charge, to be honest with you. But their melee stats do leave something to be desired, but for a javelin cav, that's to be expected. They have 18 missile damage, though, and they have 72 in the unit. They cost 750, which is not bad for the amount of damage they can potentially do. They inspire nearby troops. They're good at hiding in the woods. They're good versus cavalry and armor. They have good armor and excellent stamina. All of this combines to them being better than the Riddermark skirmishers, and, well, at least in terms of their stats. I don't know if there's anything hidden going on that I should be aware of, but really these guys, well, girls, will be better than the Riddermark skirmishers because of their base damage. You know, their base damage and their being good versus cavalry means if you embed them in your army, or at least your cavalry, you're going to be able to mow down enemy cavalry from range while your cavalry is able to hold the line in melee. That's true against both Gondor and the High Elf now, because this is an option that neither of those two have. And it can really tip the balance, and I'm a big fan of Rohan's new units, honestly. It's given them the buff they needed, and they are now very, very viable, especially in a field battle because of their cavalry. But we will now move on to the Orcs of the Misty Mountains, who have also been given some neat new things. So the Misty Mountains may have only been given 2 new units, but they are pretty significant in terms of the power that the Misty Mountains now have in melee, because they are both very high tier units. We'll start off here with the Black Watch Legion. Of course, some of them you can see the skulls that they've got for, like, banners. That's interesting. But yes, you can see from the size of their shields what these guys are going to be all about. They only have 15 attack, but they have 59 defense and 3 charge. They have 2 hit points. They have 152 men in the unit. They cost 770 florins. They inspire nearby troops. They can form shield wall, of course. They inspire fear in nearby enemies, and they have excellent armor and stamina. Now, the Black Watch Legion have one function, really, which they excel at, and that is that they can absorb arrow fire better than I think any other unit in the game at the moment. With one possible exception, which I will be going through in a little bit. Their defense of 59 hit points, excellent armor and stamina, they were designed essentially so that you couldn't mow down them with arrow fire. An interesting idea, because I think that the archers have grown in their power a little too much in Reforged, because if you're an archer heavy faction, you can sit back with your high tier archers and mow the enemy down mercilessly, and there's not much you can do. At least as the Orcs, because as the Orcs you need to be aggressive, because that's what you're all about. The Black Watch Legion provide a first line of attack, which means that you can't really easily do that to the Misty Mountains anymore. And it's a very interesting unit, because if you're on a defense in a siege as well, these guys would be very useful. I can't imagine that if you put them in shield wall and guard mode and you have like a couple of layers of them, that any sort of attack force is going to get through in a hurry. Very, very sturdy unit. Of course, they're not particularly great in terms of their attack score, but that's not what they're for. They're a very interesting unit because there's not really a lot of units like this where they have a very single function that they work from. You know, usually it's a very simple matter of are you infantry, are you archers, or cavalry, you have an archetype and you stick to it and it's all based on your stats. But this is an interesting unit. I like it. I also like the look of them. I like the giant shields. I like the fact that they look kind of menacing. In Shield Wall as well. Let's have a look at what they look like in Shield Wall. Well, they're not going to raise their shield, so they're not going to cooperate. But there you are. The Black Watch Legion. Now we have another unit. Now this is basically the opposite end of the spectrum. The Blackback Mountain Berserkers. Now these are all about the damage they can cause, because they have 42 attack, 38 defense, and 15 charge. They have 3 hit points, 123 men in the unit. They cost 1200 florins. They inspire. They can hide anywhere, as you can see. They're good versus armor and in the snow, and they have excellent armor. If I were to compare this to a unit, at least based on what I've seen from its stats and what I believe it's going to be good at, I would compare them to the Castellans of Dol Guldur from Moss and I think Divide and Conquer, where they are a very high damage unit and they will get a lot of damage done. But ultimately they will fade because they don't have any sort of stamina enhancement, at least from what I can see. And also there aren't very many of them and they're not really focused on defense. They are ideal as a first wave up onto the walls, particularly if you back them up with trolls. It's going to be a very damaging thing you're going to have to try and deal with. They are essentially shock infantry. With their, instead of one large weapon, however, they dual wield these rather interesting, like rusted swords by the looks of things. This is probably the Misty Mountains' scariest of the 2 new units, mainly because the Black Watch Legion are more for defensive purposes and more for dealing with the threat of arrows, whereas these guys are all about the damage they can cause, and it is significant. I don't know whether they would be one of the best shock infantries, mainly because I fear that they could suffer from a lack of survivability and stamina, perhaps, but it could be that their overall damage will carry the day because it is significant. 42 attack and being armor piercing, and that 3 hit points means they will last a decent amount of time in melee despite their slightly lower defense next to their peers. An interesting new unit, and I think that the Misty Mountains needed their high tier units, and they are now a faction to be taken seriously, just like Rohan. And there is one more thing that I'm going to show you before this video ends. Now you may be wondering what we're doing with Balin's Guard on the screen. Well, the truth is they're not called Balin's Guard anymore, they're called the Mithril Guard. And the reason is because their stats have been changed up pretty significantly, and this is more what you can expect from the dwarves going forward, I believe. Because they have 28 attack, 86 defense, and 5 charge, they also have 6 hit points. So when I was saying earlier about the Blackwatch Legion being the best at dealing with arrows, bar one, this was the one I was talking about, because I can't really see arrows doing any sort of damage to these guys in a hurry. They only have 63 men in the unit, and they do cost 2,000 florins, so 2,000 is a very significant amount. With how strong they are, though, I would say that they're certainly worth it. It's very difficult to kill these guys. 2,000 florins, though, does somewhat balance them, I think. As long as, like, you can only have one, I think that it's fine, particularly seeing as the dwarves are going to be all about this in the future, sort of a very small army, but very survivable, very defensive as well. Obviously they can inspire, they can form shield wall, they're effective against armor because of their axes, they're good in the snow, excellent armor and stamina. The only downside is they can't hide, but you don't really need to hide, let's be honest. But yeah, that's the Mithril Guard, so a pretty serious rebalance and a renaming, but it is essentially Balin's Guard, and they are now very, very easily the best heavy infantry, shall we say. And that is all of the new things from 8.5, and I hope this was somewhat informative for you.